Hello, my name is Eugene Chausovsky, and I'm a Eurasia analyst here at Stratfor. And joining me today is fellow Eurasia analyst Lauren Goodrich. And we'll be discussing some challenges and opportunities for Russia in the context of the crisis in Ukraine. So, Lauren, there's been a lot of negative talk, a lot of negative reporting about the state of Russia's economy. The ruble is at an all-time low. Sanctions from the Europeans have influenced the economy this year. What is the current state of the economy, and how do you see that moving forward in the next 3 months or so?
The Russian economy has certainly suffered due to the crisis in Ukraine and Western perceptions of Russia at this time. Russian growth this year is going to be flat. The World Bank says that Russia's already in recession, though Russia argues that they're just slightly above recession levels at this time. Foreign investment inside the country has dropped in half this year. Capital flight will most likely reach around $100 billion. So the Russian economy is suffering due to the negative attention on Russia during the past 3 quarters. However, the Russian government is weathering this. They have plenty of financial reserves in the bank. They have around $650 billion in the piggy bank. They've had to use around $1.6 billion just this week alone in order to stabilize the ruble. They've used about $51 billion total this year in order to stabilize the currency. And they're going to have to continue on spending, particularly because the Russian government is now going to be stepping in and financially assisting a lot of the big state firms and the really large energy firms that are suffering due to the sanctions from the West. And so the Russian government has the money to spend, but they're going to have to spend it because the Russian economy needs it so bad.
Okay, so it sounds like what you're saying is that despite the economy suffering up until now, Russia has the tools in order to stem any sort of major weakening in these next few months.
Very much so. And the Russian government has been very lucky in that oil has stayed above $90. The Russian budget was originally set on 114 oil, which is extraordinarily high for any government to rely on. And with oil currently in the 90s, the Russian government is lucky that oil at least stayed in the triple digits for the first 3 quarters of the year in order for them to have enough revenues for them to be able to weather the lower price for this 4th quarter. So the Russian government is lucky that it has at least above $90 oil. And that's going to help them for this 4th quarter to be able to weather the continued sanctions, the continued pressures on their economy, and the need for them to spend as much money as they need to.
Right. And in terms of the sanctions, I mean, one thing that we've been noticing and that we've been covering on the broader geopolitical climate between Russia and the Europeans is there hasn't been a decrease in that relationship in the sense that the fighting that's happening right now in eastern Ukraine, while it's continuing, there has been kind of a decrease in the escalation of that combat. There's a ceasefire in place, and of course, attacks are still continuing in some of the hotspots around Donetsk airport and other areas, but there haven't been any major military moves either out of Russia or on the Ukrainian side, which that is then driving the Europeans to, especially countries like Germany, France, Italy, they don't want to increase sanctions on Russia at the moment. In fact, they're even talking about the possibility of easing them based off of what happens on the ground. Of course, you have some countries in Europe that are opposed to this, countries like Poland, the Baltic states, which want to keep up the pressure on Russia. But that kind of the drive against the Russian economy that has been really influenced by the Europeans up until now, we do see that sort of calming down in this next quarter.
Yeah, we've moved into a new era within this crisis. You know, we're not in the combat era anymore. We're now into the negotiation phase. And we've even seen the United States come out and say that they're even willing to ease sanctions on the Russians. And the Russians, in turn, have countered and said, okay, we're willing to ease our counter-sanctions against the Europeans as well. And so there's room for negotiation, and that's the era and the phase that we're now moving into, both between the Russians and the Ukrainians negotiating, but also the Russians, the Europeans, and the United States negotiating.
Right. And one other interesting aspect that doesn't get as much coverage, I think, in the media is that, yes, while Russia has suffered economically this year, there has also been some positive sides for Russia, namely in its own kind of economic grouping that Russia has been working on for the past several years. It has a customs union with Belarus and Kazakhstan, and these countries have actually only gotten closer with Russia as a result of the crisis in Ukraine. They're going to be forming the Eurasian Union, which will debut at the beginning of next year. And you even have some other countries within the former Soviet space that are joining that union next year. You have Armenia, Kyrgyzstan will likely join later in the year. So these are countries that despite or even because of the crisis in Ukraine, want to integrate more closely with Russia, even despite its problems on the economic front?
I agree. There's multiple levels on this in which the crisis in Ukraine has kind of polarized the choices for these countries, especially the former Soviet states, in that they do now have to choose, do they want to be closer to the West or do they want to be closer to Russia? And it's all about opportunities. Which one is going to offer you more opportunities, whether it's investment, whether it's going to be markets, whether it's going to be energy ties. And for most of the former Soviet states, particularly the ones in Central Asia and the Caucasus, meaning Armenia, it's Russia. The West doesn't offer those opportunities that Russia offers them. And so for those countries, because there is such a polarization between the West and Russia at this time, they are having to choose, and Russia's pretty much the only choice for them.
Right. So where on the one hand you have countries like Ukraine, of course, first and foremost, but also others, Moldova, Georgia, the Baltic states that are trying to get closer to the West, that are very concerned about the Russia's military posturing in Ukraine. There are still countries that are getting closer to Russia, and so as we've seen, this has offered Russia some opportunities, but as well as the economic challenges that we've seen, which will be pretty interesting to see how Russia deals with that in the coming months. But that's about all we have time for, Lauren. Thanks very much for joining me, and thank you for joining us. For more information, please go to stratfor.com.